I'm going to show you two nightstands and I want you to tell me which one you like the best. So on the left here we've got a very typical, very traditional, fairly uniform brown piece, and on the right we have the natural wood, which naturally has a lot of variation in the grain and tones, colors of the wood. Now what if I told you these were actually from the same set? The one on the left is originally what it would have looked like, and the one on the right is after stripping off all of that old uniform brown finish, replacing that traditional kind of outdated hardware with something a little bit more modern. And that was pretty much all that was done here. Now, these old brass pulls, people either love them or hate them. Most furniture flippers hate them. They absolutely do match the style of the piece and the era, but you can refinish a piece like this, giving it a little bit more of a modern look while not completely turning your back on the time period that this was built. And that is what the focus of today's video is about. To do this transformation, I'm going to be using circa 1850 stripper, a couple of different stripper brushes and a scraper, 150, 180 grit, and a fine grit foam pad. If there's any chips or dings that I need to fill, I will use this Timbermate Cherry wood filler. Some new matte black hardware. The finish I'm going to be using is Odie's oil, some Scotch-Brite stripping pads that I've cut down, and some white non-woven pads to apply the Odie's oil. So first things first, let's have a look at this. This is made by Hardin Furniture, which is a family-run American business founded in 1844 that ran for about 175 years. Now, talking again about these pulls for a moment, there are people that either love them or hate them. I am in the latter category. I find it very hard to sell a piece with this specific style of pull, even if it's painted black. As such, I'm going to be removing the hardware that came with this and putting on something a little bit more modern. Even though that furniture company was founded in the 1800s, this piece is not that old. This would be, I'd say, 60s and forward. It's not an antique, but if you have something that looks similar to this, make sure you do your research and find out when it was made, because some of these pieces are quite old, and stripping off that original finish, as long as it's in good condition, can sometimes devalue a piece. But again, that's if the finish is actually in good condition. If the finish is shot and peeling and flaking, obviously it has to be restored. I actually picked this set up from an online auction site unseen. I saw a picture of it, but I didn't get to inspect them in person. And I initially thought that these were veneer over chipboard or presswood, which is very, very common with this style of furniture from the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. It sat in storage for about a year, and my plan for these was to refinish the top and paint the bodies, because it's not a very desirable style of furniture anymore. But once I got these home, finally, and started to inspect them, I realized that these were actually solid cherry. Everything. There's no veneer anywhere. And while that doesn't necessarily make it a more valuable piece, because there are plenty of valuable pieces that are veneer, it does, however, make me rethink my plans of painting part of this. So what I thought was going to be a quick flip ended up taking almost a week start to finish, because these did take quite a while to strip all of that old dark finish out and remove the dye stain that they would have used underneath. So on a piece like this, usually there is a finishing schedule, which is essentially a checklist of the method of finish. And you'll see it a little bit later on when I go to strip the top. Starting from the outside working inward, there is a top coat, clear coat. Underneath that is a layer of colored toners and glazes, and that's what gives it its more uniform finish and kind of helps mute the natural variation in the wood grain. And underneath that is a dye stain, which would have been applied to the raw wood. Just a quick side note here, my voice is a little raspy. I had a bit of an asthma fit the other night and my voice hasn't quite recovered, so I apologize for the kind of scratchy sound in this video. Toners, glazes, and top coats can all be taken off with stripper, but dye stain actually absorbs right into the wood, so you can't strip that off. That is where sanding will come in once I get all of the old finish off, and why I'm grateful that this is solid wood. It just allows me to sand a little bit more than if this was a veneered piece. So that is the residual color you're seeing once all of the top coats are off. This is what's left of the dye stain. So in addition to that hardware that I don't love, this is the other thing that I don't love about this style of furniture. They usually have some sort of wood applique in the shape of a fan or a seashell. In this case, it's carved right into the board. So there's no removing it to quote unquote modernize the piece. Something that happens specifically with cherry and a few other woods is ghosting, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on once we get to sanding, but it's essentially when the wood around the hardware of a piece darkens over time, but the wood underneath the hardware stays light, and yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit. So this is going to be a pretty good example of those layers that I was talking about on the top. Tops of furniture often have thicker top coats than the sides or front of pieces. So normally you would put your layer of stripper on and let it sit a little bit longer on the top. Here, I let it sit on just a couple of minutes and tried to scrape it off because I wanted to show you those different levels. So what's coming off here initially is basically the top coat. There's a little bit of the color coat coming off too, but this is mostly the top coat coming off, as well as any old furniture waxes and polishes that have dirt embedded into it from, years of use. That's all going to come off with the first layer. You can see I'm not down to the raw wood, so I'm going to apply some more stripper. And this time, this is going to take off that layer of toners and glazes that sits on top of the raw wood. That is why for people that like to sand finishes off, which I don't normally recommend unless the finish is pretty much non-existent, but when you sand a finish off on the top, it often takes longer, and that's why it's just much thicker to begin with. So you can see a little bit of the outline of the hardware here, but it's once we sand it off that you're going to see that ghosting I was talking about. And what that's going to look like is basically a lighter sort of outline of where the hardware was. And when you're staining a piece or just clear coating, this is a problem if you're changing hardware that's not going to fit directly over top of that because it will show through. Sometimes that's why pieces end up getting painted. People just don't understand how to get rid of that. And it doesn't help that the process to eliminate that could be different from piece to piece. So if you have a piece like this and you're not sure if it is solid wood or veneer, often looking at the underside can really help. Quite often you will see the sandwich components, which would be veneer on the outside, then your pressed wood in between, and then veneer on the inside of the piece. Other things to look for are wood grain that flows over the edge of things. So if you're looking at the top and you see the wood grain, the lines in the grain flow over the top and down the side in one straight line, that's a good indication that it's solid wood, whereas veneer, often the sides of pieces will have grain running in a different direction because that is edge banding that's been applied. Veneer also tends to have repeating patterns. So like on a big, let's say 6-foot mid-century walnut dresser, if you see those big cathedrals in the wood grain that repeat several times across, that's a good indication that is also veneer. Veneer is still one of the most misunderstood things about furniture, and a while back I did a video on comparing solid wood to veneer to laminate and how to tell the difference between those things. I am going to be doing a new video on that, updated with a bit more information for you guys. So I'm starting my sanding with 150 grit. There's no need to do something like an 80 on this because I have removed the majority of the finish. It's pretty much just the dye stain remaining. Now looking here at the drawer, I'm just going to tip this forward. This is what I meant by ghosting, and that is the impression or the outline of the hardware because it's protecting the wood underneath from the UV light, which darkens cherry specifically. You can't stain it away unless you apply stain over everything and then add a little extra stain there. Sometimes that works. Oxalic acid on the drawer face except where that was sometimes works, so you'd be putting the oxalic acid on everything but where the hardware was. But on solid wood, the easiest thing to do is just sand it off or try to find hardware that's going to cover it. In this case, I'm using very thin pulls on the drawer faces, so that's not going to work for me. On some pieces, I've stained and then used graining markers or pigments to try to camouflage. Sometimes you have to do that. There's multiple ways you can do it, and each piece is a little bit different. So you can see here along these rounded edges and also on that recessed area in the doors, I was using this foam pad. This allows me to sand without getting rid of that profile, which in essence saves you a lot of time. And even on this carved area here, I end up having to use a lot of hand sanding just to get in those cracks, but using the foam allowed me to sand most of it by machine versus by hand. So here's what this piece looks like completely stripped down. It's a beautiful light wood, but it's actually not. So I'm going to be using Odie's on this, and you'll see as soon as I apply the Odie's, it's going to turn dark. This isn't the Odie's oil staining the wood dark. Cherry is a naturally darker reddish wood. If I were to even put water on this, it would still turn this color. But for people just starting out that don't really understand this, they are often very surprised. And I see a lot of posts on Facebook groups that I'm a member of with beginners asking, showing a picture of their piece initially and saying, what top coat can I use on this to keep it from turning dark? Often this is cherry or walnut or mahogany, all woods that look light when they're sanded down and immediately go dark when there's a top coat applied. And the truth is, there isn't really a single top coat that is going to not bring out the natural color of the wood. The only way to keep it light would be to either use a 2-part bleaching agent, use like a liming agent, or doing a beige wash or a tan wash or a white wash with paint, and then sealing. Any top coat I put on this cherry would turn it this color. And this is looking beautiful. So with Odie's oil, you need to work it into the wood, let it sit on the wood for a while, and then you need to remove all of the excess oil. I'm applying this now. You can still see a little bit of the ghosting, but as this Odie's sort of sets in and the color deepens slightly, it's not going to be nearly as noticeable. Just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who has supported me in my channel and watched along as I take these pieces of furniture on. I literally can't do it without your help, so everyone who has liked and commented and shared and subscribed, all of those things are free and they really help me out. So huge thank you. So you've seen me apply the Odie's oil. Sometimes I use a Mercury Milan pad, and often I use these white pads as well. But I never thought before this video to apply it to my SurfPrep and use that to help buff it in. You often see people doing these big epoxy tables, big slabs of wood, and they often have one of these pads on a buffer, and it helps kind of spread the oil in. One thing to consider though, this isn't going to help remove the oil. So don't look at this as a quick way to get all of that excess oil off, because it's not going to work. All this is doing is moving the oil around, heating it up, and helping to kind of burnish it into that wood grain, which saves your arms, honestly, because Odie's can be pretty labor intensive to apply, even though it's totally fun and I love it. This was definitely a game changer for me, and I'll probably be doing it on every Odie's piece that I do from now on. So as the oil sets up, depending on the wood, you'll start to see it sort of absorb in some spots and maybe not in others. And that's just the nature of wood. Some parts are more absorbent than others, but putting this pad on my sander just helps me kind of redistribute that a little bit, and then I can set it aside for maybe another 20 minutes before I buff it all off. This made a huge difference, and excited to share that with you guys. So which one do you like better? Are you drawn more towards the more traditional uniform brown, very classic look? Or do you prefer to see wood in its natural beauty with all of its variation and imperfections? This is always going to be subjective, but I'm curious, which one do you like better? My goal was really to revamp these and modernize them a little bit without completely stepping away from the history of the piece. I really just wanted to emphasize the natural beauty of the cherry. Now, not everybody likes the color of natural cherry, which does darken with age. Maybe not quite that dark, but it will darken over time. I love the natural variations in the wood tone, so for me, this is a winner. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Enjoy the final reveal of both of these pieces redone, and I will see you next time.